Hello, everybody. Welcome to another reading session of the Introduction to Western Philosophy by Jostein Gaarder. The name of the book that we are reading is Sophie's World. So today in the panel, we are already joined by lawyer Shravan Kumar Garu as well as the would-be teacher Daoji. So welcome to the panelists. And without any delay, I will get started. Hello, sir.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and for everybody who is going to watch the video in the future, as well as whoever might join our panel, today is Father's Day in the Western Hemisphere. So happy Father's Day. I know in the Eastern cultures, these days are not very, there's nothing special because usually kids are raised by the parents, etc., etc. There's a long history about it. So net is whoever is celebrating today, happy Father's Day. So with that said, let's go to the next part of the introduction here. So last week we had a very spirited conversation and discussion regarding the Western approach and how Sophie's it started impacting how she performed in her tests, and then she ended up getting an A in the paper. And even without doing the homework, she's able to now write some frameworks, though not necessarily related to the study material, but the teacher is quite impressed by what uh, what she had written basically. Obviously, a little bit concerned because she's talking about ideas that are very fundamental. So, with that said, Sophie came back and then she found another brown envelope, which essentially means that she's going to get introduced to another new concept. So, let's proceed. Okay, the subchapter in this particular book for what we are going to read is titled Hellenism, as in Hellenism, basically, right? So here we go. So here we are again, Sophie. So this is she's reading from the brown envelope now, basically. So um, she's being given this message. Here we are again, Sophie, having read about the natural philosophers and Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. You are now familiar with the foundations of European philosophy. So from now on, we will drop the introductory questions which you earlier received in white envelopes. I imagine you probably have plenty of other assignments and tests at school. I shall now tell you about the long period from Aristotle near the end of 4th century BCE up to early Middle Ages around AD 400. Notice that we can now write both BC and AD because Christianity was, in fact, one of the most important and the most mysterious factors of the period. Aristotle died in the year 322 BC. At the time when Athens had lost its dominant role, uh, when did Aristotle die? Aristotle died in the year 322 BC, at the time when Athens had lost its dominant role. This was not least due to the political upheavals resulting from the conquest of Alexander the Great, who lived between 356 and 323 BC. Alexander the Great was the king of Macedonia. Aristotle was also from Macedonia, and for a time, he was even the young Alexander's tutor. It was Alexander who won the final decisive victory over the Persians. And moreover, Sophie, with his many conquests, he linked both Egypt and the Orient as far east as India to the Greek civilization. This marked the beginning of a new epoch in the history of mankind. Epoch is a long period of time that can be clearly demarcated. Uh, a civilization sprang up in which Greek culture and Greek language played a leading role. This period, which lasted about 300 years, is known as Hellenism. Okay, so Hellenism is nothing but a period in which the Greek culture and Greek language um, and its civilization played a leading role in the history of mankind. This period, which lasted about 300 years, is known as Hellenism. The term Hellenism refers to both the period of time and the Greek dominated culture that prevailed in the three Hellenistic kingdoms of Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt. However, from about the year 500 BC, Rome secured the upper hand in military and political affairs, Rome being part of Italy, not Greece. The new superpower gradually conquered all Hellenistic kingdoms, and from then on, Roman culture and the Latin language were predominant from Spain in the west to far into Asia. This was the beginning of the Roman period, which we often refer to as late antiquity. But remember one thing, before the Romans managed to conquer the Hellenistic world, Rome itself was a province of Greek culture. So, Greek culture and Greek philosophy came to play an important role long after the political influence of the Greeks was a thing of the past. Okay, so let's see. All right. So here, obviously, the author is trying to delineate between the Greek and Roman cultures, and he's pointing out, or she's pointing out, that the Greek culture predated the Roman culture. Okay, so the next up, so and the author also defined what Hellenism is. Essentially, the Greek civilization that took sway over the world or the Middle East at that what we now call as Middle East or the Greater Middle East during that period of time for 300 years almost. So Egypt, Syria, and Macedonia were the three main Hellenistic kingdoms that eventually Rome conquered. Okay, so the next subchapter we are going to read is called Religion, Philosophy, and Science. I mean, even the terms are quite interesting, right? Very big topics. Hellenism was characterized by the fact that the borders between the various countries and cultures became erased. Previously, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Syrians, and the Persians had worshipped their own gods within what we generally call a national religion. Now, the different cultures merged into one great, which is cauldron of religious, philosophical, and scientific ideas. So, essentially, what happened was everything became mixed, right? Cauldron is essentially a big vessel in which you put all kinds of ingredients where the witches cook their potions, basically, right? That's what the author is referring to. We could perhaps say the town square was replaced by the world arena. The old town square also had also buzzed with voices, bringing now different wares to the market, now different thoughts and ideas. The new aspect was that town squares were being filled with wares and ideas from all over the world. The voices were buzzing in many different languages. So previously, the town square was limited to the people of the town. Now it became more of a global cauldron of ideas, voices, etc. Okay. We have already mentioned that the Greek view of life was now much more widespread than it had been in the former Greek cultural areas. But as time went on, Oriental gods were also worshipped in all the Mediterranean countries. New religious formations arose that could draw on the gods and the beliefs of many of the old nations. This is called syncretism or the fusion of creeds. So we keep talking about syncretic culture, right? Especially our the great left liberal media that dominates India, that used to quite a bit until recently. They refer to this. The typical term that is used in India, especially, is called Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, right? Which is essentially some kind of a mixed culture between the invading Arabs or the invading Islamic armies and the local Hindu or the local Sanatana culture, right? Of course, now the entire phrase has been debunked because there is no such thing as Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb. It's just a colonizing force that came, right? The local culture is the only one that prevailed or and is going to most likely prevail going into the future. So this syncretism was seen even in the Greek civilization or during the Hellenistic period. Prior to this, people had felt a strong affinity with their own folk and their own city state. City state, okay? So, Athens, for example, was a city state. Much like if you look at the Vatican, for example, today, that's an example of what is a city state, right? It's a country, but it's essentially a city. But as the borders and boundaries became erased, many people began to experience doubt and uncertainty about their philosophy of life. Late antiquity, which is the Roman period, was generally characterized by religious doubts, cultural dissolution. Dissolution means dissolving, basically, right? So cultures were getting dissolved, mixed, right? So when there is a mixture, there's always one culture that potentially has more flavor. It adds more flavor to the final dish, right? So some cultures will dominate more than the others. And pessimism. So late antiquity also had a lot of pessimism associated with it in terms of questioning, doubting, basically. It was said that the world has grown old, in quotes. Okay. A common feature of the new religious formation during the Hellenistic period was that they frequently contained teachings about how mankind could attain salvation from death. See, this is a very important concept, right? These teachings were often secret. By accepting the teachings and performing certain rituals, a believer could hope for the immortality of the soul and eternal life, right? Enter the more Christian concept. A certain insight into the true nature of the universe could just be as important for the salvation of the soul as religious rituals. So much for the new religion, Sophie. But philosophy was also moving increasingly in the direction of, in quotes, salvation and serenity. Philosophic insight, it was now thought, did, did not only have its own reward, did not only have its own reward, it should also free mankind from pessimism and the fear of death. So these are all expectations that were being put on all these religious, philosophical, all these ideas, right? So what is the goal? The goal is not just salvation or to um, just be a reward in itself. There should be some material outcome, basically, right? That is getting rid of pessimism and the potential fear of death, which everybody is eventually afraid of. Death attacks, right? That's what is the constant, um, uh, the sword of Damocles that hangs on everybody. Thus, the boundaries between religion and philosophy were gradually eliminated. So, because the expectations are the same from both religion and philosophy, slowly they started merging, right? In general, the philosophy of Hellenism was not startlingly original. No new Plato or Aristotle appeared on the scene. On the contrary, the three great Athenian philosophers were a source of inspiration to a number of philosophic trends, which I shall briefly describe in a moment. So, this was a time period when there were no towering figures, but essentially all the ideas that they espoused or that they proposed were being assimilated into the society. So, this is more of a period of consolidation, right? Where there's no new person or a new great philosopher, but the philosophies were slowly being assimilated into the society. Hellenistic science, too, was influenced by a blend of knowledge from the various cultures. The town of Alexandria played a key role here as a meeting place between the East and the West. While Athenians remained the center of the philosophy, with still functioning schools of philosophy after Plato and Aristotle, Alexandria became the center of science. So philosophy came from Athens, science, the hub of science was Alexandria. With its extensive library, it became the center of mathematics, astronomy, biology, and medicine. Hellenistic culture could well be compared to the world of today. The 20th century was also influenced by an increasingly open civilization. In our own time, too, this opening out has resulted in tremendous upheavals for religion and philosophy. And just as in Rome, around the beginning of the Christian era, one could come across Greek, Egyptian, and Oriental religions. Today, as we approach the end of the 20th century, we can find in all European cities of any size religions from all parts of the world. So it's a fairly mixed population that espouses various beliefs and cultures today. And so was the case with cities like Alexandria during the Hellenistic culture. We also see nowadays how a conglomeration of old and new religions, philosophies, and sciences can form the basis of new offers on the view of life market. In quotes, view of life market. So there is a market that the author is imagining here called the view of life market. There is a blend of new and old that typically are very popular, right? Like, for example, the westernized yoga is something that comes to my mind, right? So yoga is a very ancient Indian concept, and the more later forms, the westernized forms, are a blended form of yoga that is more palatable to the western palate, basically, right? That is appetizing. Much of this new knowledge, in quotes, is actually the flotsam of old thought, some of whose roots go back to Hellenism. So even today, the new philosophies are essentially flotsam, means something that floats up, right? Like jetsam or whatever it is, right? So if you're traveling in the sea and then suddenly you see the some wood that is floating, or some things that are floating from a wreckage or something like that, that's called float sand. Things that are randomly floating. So this so-called new knowledge that is being peddled in this day and age, the author claims, is nothing but remnants of some of the old thought that essentially can be more or less dated back to the era of Hellenism, right? The Greek dominance of the world civilization. As I have said, Hellenistic philosophy continued to work with the problems raised by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Common to them all was their desire to discover how mankind should best live and die. They were concerned with ethics. In a new civilization, this became the central philosophical project. The main emphasis was on finding out what true happiness was and how it could be achieved. We are going to look at four of these philosophical trends. So, what we'll do is we're going to look at these trends, and then with that, we'll stop the reading and potentially discuss, and then we can close today. And again, today, I think because it's Father's Day, the philosophers are all busy celebrating Father's Day with their families. Okay, so let's look at the four of these philosophical trends that became very central in terms of defining what ethics is and things like that during the Hellenistic period. The Cynics. The story goes that one day Socrates stood gazing at a stall that sold all kinds of wares. All kinds of wares means all kinds of things. Finally, he said, "What a lot of things I don't need." This statement could be the motto for the Cynic school of philosophy founded by Antisthenes in Athens around 400 BCE. Antisthenes had been a pupil of Socrates and had become particularly interested in this in his frugality. The Cynics emphasized that true happiness is not found in external advantages such as material luxury, political power, or good health. True happiness lies in not being dependent on such random and fleeting things. And because happiness does not consist in benefits of this kind, it is within everyone's reach. Moreover, having once attained, it can never be lost. Right? So it's almost like the Tyaga. Tyaga, the Indian, they say Tyage naike amrutatva manatsu. Right? It's not what you accumulate that gives you pleasure, whether it's in the form of material goods, power, whatever it is. It is what you give up that gives you happiness, basically, right? So happiness comes from giving up, not accumulating. The best known of the cynics was Diogenes, a pupil of Antisthenes, who reputedly lived in a barrel and owned nothing but a cloak, a stick, and a bread bag. So it wasn't really in the author is saying, so it wasn't easy to steal his happiness from him. So there's nothing for him to lose. So if somebody stole what he had, it was not difficult for him to gain them back. And more importantly, there was not much to steal anyway, right? So that's the idea. You don't attach your happiness to material things or physical things, then your happiness is everlasting, right? Or it lasts forever. That's why the Satchidananda concept even says that your body and mind are not you. Why is that the Ananda state? Because even the body and mind can be taken away from you, basically, right? If you have nothing to lose, then there's only one thing that is left, which is Ananda, happiness. One day, while he was sitting beside his barrel enjoying the sun, he was visited by Alexander the Great. The emperor stood before him and asked if there was anything he could do for him. Was there anything he desired? That's what Alexander asked him. Yes, Diogenes replied. Stand to one side. You are blocking the sun. Wonderful reply. Thus, Diogenes showed that he was no less happy and rich than the great man before him. He had everything he desired. All right. So Alexander was given a nice lesson in philosophy right then and there, I guess. Wonderful. The cynics believed that people did not need to be concerned about their own health. Even suffering and death should not disturb them, nor should they let themselves be tormented by concern for other people's woes. Nowadays, the terms cynical and cynicism have come to mean a sneering disbelief in human sincerity, and they imply insensitivity to other people's suffering. So somewhere in the somewhere historically there was there was a flipping, or there was a difference in interpretation of being cynicism, being cynical, which meant something negative, pejorative, basically, right? But cynicism had its roots in very strong philosophy that believed in frugality and being happy with very little material possessions, basically, few material possessions. Okay, so the next, so we finished one out of four, right? So philosophical trends. The second philosophical trend during that time was the Stoics, basically. So this is the next subchapter. The Cynics were instrumental in the development of the Stoic school of philosophy, which grew up in Athens around 300 BC. Its founder was Zeno, who came originally from Cyprus and joined the Cynics in Athens after being shipwrecked. So he came from Cyprus but was marooned or shipwrecked, and because of that, he ended up joining the Cynics in Athens. He used to gather his followers under a portico. Portico essentially is a porch, right? Is like a um, uh, it's exactly a porch, basically. The name Stoic comes from the Greek word for portico. I see. Stew. Okay. Stoicism was later to have a great significance for Roman culture. Like Heraclitus, the Stoics believed that everyone was a part of the same common sense or logos. They thought that each person was like a world in miniature or microcosmos, which is a reflection of the macrocosmos, right? So even in the Indian philosophy, there is a saying, right, which is Andanda is Brahmanda or something like that, basically, right? So similarly, the microcosm, the world, the entire universe is a microcosm that is reflected in each person. This led to the thought that there exists a universal rightness, the so-called natural law, and because this natural law was based on timeless human and universal reason, it did not alter with time and space. In this, then, the Stoics sided with Socrates against the Sophists. Natural law governed all mankind, even slaves. The Stoics considered the legal statutes of the various states merely as incomplete imitations of the law embedded in nature itself. In the same way that the Stoics erased the difference between the individual and the universe, they also denied any conflict between spirit and matter, right? In quotes. There was only one nature. They averred. Aver means to state, right? And aver is to state something, basically, right? This kind of idea is called monism. All right. In contrast to Plato's clear dualism or twofold reality. Okay, so we also have a school of monism which is very popular in India. It's called Advaita Vedanta, basically, right? Good. As truth, so you can see, as I was reading, you can see the parallels, right? So the law of nature, there is a natural law, and microcosm is the macrocosm. These are all ideas that are also embedded in the Indian philosophical constructs. As true children of their time, the Stoics were distinctly cosmopolitan, in that they were more receptive to contemporary culture than the barrel philosophers or the cynics, basically. Okay, they drew attention to human fellowship. They were preoccupied with politics, and many of them, notably the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, AD 121 to 180, were active statesmen. So I believe Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic. They encouraged Greek culture and philosophy in Rome, one of the most distinguished of them being the orator, philosopher, and statesman Cicero, right? 106 to 43 BC. We often quote Cicero even in Lawyer Garu's channel. So wonderful. So they're all Stoics, basically. Okay. So now it was he. So he was encouraging Greek culture quite a bit in the Roman state, I guess. It was he who formed the very concept of humanism, in quotes, that is a view of life that has the individual as its central focus. I guess it contrasts significantly with the humanism of this day and age, at any rate. Some years later, Stoic Seneca, 4 BCE to AD 65, said that to mankind, mankind is holy. That is the quote. This has remained a slogan for humanism ever since. Okay. The Stoics, moreover, emphasized that all natural processes, such as sickness and death, follow the unbreakable laws of nature. Man must therefore learn to accept his destiny. Nothing happens accidentally, everything happens through necessity. So it is of little use to complain when fate comes knocking at the door. One must also accept the happy events of life unperturbed, they thought, right? In this, we see their kinship with the cynics who claimed that all external events were unimportant. Even today, we use the term stoic calm about someone who does not let his feelings take over, basically, right? So, it is no different, or it is very similar to what we call sthita prajna, basically, right? Sthita prajna is somebody who is stoic in the face of happiness or sadness or whatever comes, right? So, stoic is somebody who remains calm, who does not let his feelings take over. In this case, his means her also. So, we don't have to. The author herself is a female, so we don't have to do this man, woman, his, her situation here. Okay. So, the third school of thought, they're called the Epicureans. So, what did they say? As we have seen, Socrates was concerned with finding out how man could live a good life. Both the cynics and the Stoics interpreted his philosophy as meaning that man had to free himself from material luxuries. But Socrates also had a pupil named Aristippus. He believed that the aim of life was to attain the highest possible sensory enjoyment. Wonderful. For every, all these philosophers have students. For every student that says, no material happiness, there's always somebody who says material happiness, right? He believed that the aim of life was to attain the highest possible sensory enjoyment. The highest good is pleasure, he said. The greatest evil is pain. So it's not too different from the Charvaka philosophy that we have, right? Highly materialistic and only materialistic. Okay. So he wished to develop a way of life whose aim was to avoid all pain in all forms. The cynics and the Stoics believed in enduring pain of all kinds, which is not the same as setting out to avoid pain, right? So the Epicureans, they set out to actually avoid pain. The Stoics and cynics were in more interested in how you respond to pain, not necessarily to avoid it or to eliminate it. So around the year 300 BCE, Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC, founded a school of philosophy in Athens. His philosophers were called Epicureans. He developed the pleasure ethic of Aristippus and combined it with the atom theory of Democritus. The story goes that the Epicureans lived in a garden. They were therefore known as the garden philosophers. I see. Above the entrance to this garden, there is said to have hung a notice saying, "Stranger, here you will live well. Here, pleasure is the highest good." Love it. Epicurus emphasized that the pleasurable result of an action must always be weighed against its possible side effects. If you have ever binged on chocolate, you know what I mean. So, Epicurean in this day and age means something related to food, cooking, and things like that, right? Nevertheless, we'll come to how that came to be, right? Of an action always must be weighed against its possible side effects. If you have ever binged on chocolate, you'll know what I mean. If you haven't tried this exercise, take all you saved up in terms of pocket money and buy 200 crowns worth of chocolate. We'll assume you like chocolate, okay, or whatever you like, food basically. It is essential to this exercise that you eat it all at one time. About half an hour later, when all that delicious chocolate is eaten, you will understand what Epicurus meant by side effects. Epicurus also believed that a pleasurable result in the short term must be weighed against the possibility of a greater, more lasting, or more intense pleasure in the long term. So essentially, you should not do things that will give you pleasure in the short term and potentially pain in the long term, right? It should do both. Maybe you abstain from eating chocolate for a whole year because you prefer to save up all your pocket money and buy a new bike or go to an expensive vacation abroad, basically. So, short term sacrifices should always be followed by long term gains. Otherwise, there's no point in giving up. So, for example, a Stoic would say, I don't want material possessions because that will lead to my ultimate happiness. But the Epicurean is going to argue saying, what is there in the long term? Right? I want something material. I give up something now, but I need something material later. Unlike animals, we are able to plan our lives. We have the ability to make a pleasure calculation. Chocolate is good, but a new bike or a trip to England is better. The utility, the entire economic utility function is essentially being described here, basically, right? Postponing your desires or your wants in order to gain something that is larger later. And the entire, even the whole lending based on interest, right? Interest based lending is essentially underpinned by this utility function here, right? If they are postponing their satisfying their need, now there is a premium to it, and the premium that you pay is called interest in this day and age. Uh, Epicurus emphasized, though, that pleasure does not necessarily mean sensual pleasure, like eating chocolate, for instance. Values such as friendship and appreciation of art also count. Moreover, the enjoyment of life required the old Greek ideals of self control, temperance, and serenity. Desire must be curbed, and serenity will help us to endure pain. Fear of the gods brought many people to the garden of Epicurus. In this connection, the atom theory of Democritus was a useful cure for religious superstitions. In order to live a good life, it is not important to overcome the fear of death. To this end, Epicurus made use of the theory of Democritus of the soul atoms. You may perhaps remember that Democritus believed there was no life after death because when we die, the soul atoms disperse in all directions. Death does not concern us, Epicurus said quite simply, because as long as we exist, death is not there. And when it does come, we no longer exist. So when you think about it, no one has ever been bothered by being dead. So essentially, very focused on life as it is, right? Not worrying about what happens after death. Epicurus summed up his liberating philosophy with what he called the four medicinal herbs. The gods are not to be feared. Death is nothing to worry about. Good is easy to attain. The fearful is easy to endure. So these are the four medicinal herbs or the statements. From a Greek point of view, there was nothing new in comparing philosophical projects with those of medicinal science. The intention was simply that man could equip himself with a philosophical medicine chest in quotes containing the four ingredients I mentioned. So philosophy is simple. God should not be feared, death is nothing to worry about, good is easy to attain, and the fearful is easy to endure. So essentially, live in the moment now. Don't worry about anything that you do not know or that you do not see right now, basically. In contrast to the Stoics, the Epicureans showed little or no interest in politics and the community. Live in seclusion was the advice of Epicurus, who could perhaps compare his garden with our present day communes. There are many people in our own time who have sought a safe harbor away from society. Right, one of the people that a very famous modern day philosopher named Henry David Thoreau. Right, he just went into the forest and lived there because he just wanted to get away from the society, basically. Right. After Epicurus, many Epicureans developed an overemphasis on self-indulgence. Their motto was live for the moment. The word Epicurean is used in a negative sense nowadays to describe someone who lives only for pleasure, basically, right? Hedonist. That's what they're called. Okay. So now comes the Charvakas in India, basically, same thing. The fourth and the final philosophy that became very popular was Neoplatonism. As I showed you, cynicism, stoicism, and Epicureanism all had their roots in the teaching of Socrates. They also made use of certain of the pre-Socratics like Heraclitus and Democritus. So they made a blend of the pre-Socratic, Socratian, if there is, that's what it's called, the philosophies that predate Socrates and the Socrates philosophies of Socrates. But the most remarkable philosophic trend in the late Hellenistic period was first and foremost inspired by Plato's philosophy. We therefore call it Neoplatonism. The most important figure in Neoplatonism was Plotinus, who lived from 205 to 270 AD, who studied philosophy in Alexandria but later settled in Rome. It is interesting to note that he came from Alexandria, the city that had been central meeting point for Greek philosophy and Oriental mysticism for several centuries. Plotinus brought with him to Rome a doctrine of salvation that was to compete seriously with Christianity when its time came. However, Neoplatonism also became a strong influence in the mainstream Christian theology as well. As with most philosophies, when they collide, there is usually an exchange of ideas, and then philosophies get adjusted, right? Both philosophies that confront each other, they usually get adjusted to incorporate some of the ideas of the philosophy with which they are competing. Remember Plato's doctrine of ideas, Sophie, and the way he distinguished between the world of ideas and the sensory world. This meant establishing a clear division between the soul and the body. Man thus became a dual creature. Our body consisted of earth and dust like everything else in the sensory world, but we also had an immortal soul. This was widely believed by many Greeks long before Plato. Plotinus was also familiar with similar ideas from Asia. There you go. Plotinus believed that the world is a span between two poles. At one end is the divine light. Sometimes he calls it light. At the other end is absolute darkness, which receives none of the light from the one. But Plotinus's point is that this darkness actually has no existence. It is simply the absence of light, in other words. In other words, it is not. All that exists is God or the one. But in the same way that a dream beam of light grows progressively dimmer and is gradually extinguished, there is somewhere a point that the divine glow cannot reach. According to Plotinus, the soul is illuminated by the light from the one, O in capital, right? While matter is the darkness that has no real existence. But the forms in nature have a faint glow of the one. Imagine a great burning bonfire in the night from which sparks fly in all directions. A wide radius of light from the bonfire turns night into day in the immediate area, but the glow from the fire is visible even from the distance of several miles. If we went even further away, we'd not be able to see even a tiny speck of light like a far off lantern in the dark. And if we went on moving away, at some point the light would not reach us. Somewhere the rays of light disappear into the night. And when it is completely dark, we see nothing. There are neither shapes nor shadows. Imagine now that reality is a bonfire like this. That which is burning is God. The darkness beyond is the cold matter that man animals are made of. Closest to God are the eternal ideas, which are the primal forms of all creatures. The human soul, above all, is the spark from the fire. Yet, everywhere in nature, some of the divine light is shining. We can see it in all living creatures, even a rose or a bluebell have its divine glow. Furthest away from the living God are earth and water and stone. I am saying that there is something of the divine mystery in everything that exists. We can see it sparkle in a sunflower or a poppy. We sense more of this unfathomable mystery in a butterfly that flutters from a twig or in a goldfish swimming in a bowl. But we are closest to God in our own soul. Only there we can become one with the great mystery of life. In truth, at very rare moments, we can experience that we ourselves are the divine mystery. Plotinus's metaphor is rather like Plato's myth of the cave. The closer we get to the mouth of the cave, the closer we get to what that which all existence springs from. But in contrast to Plato's clear twofold reality, Plotinus's doctrine is characterized by an experience of wholeness. Everything is one, for everything is God. Even the shadows deep down in Plato's cave have a faint glow of the one. On rare occasions in life, Plotinus experienced a fusion of his soul with God. We usually call this a mystical experience. Wonderful. Plotinus is not alone in having such an experience. People have told of them meaning of these mystical experiences at all times and in all cultures. The details might be different, but the essential features are the same. Let us take a look at some of these features. All right. So with that, right, I have done 40 minutes of reading, and I think we can stop here and we can start our next session with this wonderful idea of mysticism, right? So, in the Indian context, uh, the philosophy that was most close to this mysticism was, or at least most popular, was the Sufis that actually came and tried to blend Islam and Sanatana Dharma and came up with this concept of Sufism. And most of these Sufi mystics, even today, play a very critical role in the belief systems of a lot of people in India, basically, right? And there is actually a Sufi parampara as well. A lot of people are familiar with it. Nevertheless, a lot of ideas, basically, right? A lot of ancient ideas. We use these words quite a bit, especially if you read any uh, book or even concepts or even business literature that borrows some of these words, like, are you cynical, right? He is very stoic, right? That's a very Epicurean idea. Or you're being very Epicurean when you focus only on profits and don't worry about the community, that kind of stuff, right? So it's wonderful to actually read this, because it's very important to understand what the root messages are of each of these words that are still very much a part of the Western vernacular, basically. The yeah, uh, People use these words on a daily basis. So, Largar, I'll give you a chance to speak.
Yes. Absolutely, what you have said is there. See, whatever there are different kinds of culture, but the philosophy, ultimately remains the same, more or less. A little here, little there, based on their local customs, traditions, and all the kind of situation they are in. I think small things, there are different changes, and there are a lot of things which actually crept into the philosophy. For what reason, nobody knows, but it exists. You can't do anything, but it's okay. But if you go and look, the Eastern philosophy is much better than the Western philosophy at all times. That is what I can tell.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. There's a lot more clarity and the way in which things evolved, right? And you can actually see it quite a bit. Here, it's almost as if there is one city where everybody congregated and then they exchanged ideas. But in the case of India, the philosophers made sure that they traveled, right? And across India, so people say, well, India was never a single country, right? But one thing to remember is, across India, when somebody like a philosopher, like a sannyasi or like a uh, yati or somebody, right? And they used to have these distinguishing characteristics, right? When they used to come, irrespective of which king is in power, they used to respect them, right? Because they knew that these philosophers were not concerned or were never a threat to them, basically, right? So they used to come, they used to visit, they used to have a conversation, or they used to discuss, and then they used to leave, right? Which gives a lot more broader perspective, and there's a lot more blending of ideas, basically, and discussion, you know. And even kings used to conduct this Shastarartha or whatever, right? They talk about Janaka conducting this big debate in which um, what is that? This great conversation between Gargi and I forget the other gentleman's name, basically, right? So, given that
Mandana
this,
Mishra.
no, sir, no, Mandan Mishra. It's one of the Yajnavalkya, right?
Yeah.
Yajnavalkya and Gargi conversation is very popular, and it was a part of the Shastrartha, basically, right? So in Greece, you won't see that because it's a city state, right? Whereas this was not. Across India, there was a lot of commonality in terms of respecting these people, basically, right? And that is what held India together more than anything. That is one of the features, right? Because they knew that the kings used to fight and conquer kingdoms, all those things. But there was this strain of people that never were part of that equation. They had national acceptance, so to speak. Okay. Okay. That's it, sir. Anything else? Uh,
Nothing more from my side, sir.
yeah. So we have a couple of comments.
Mhm.
Omkaran garu, that comment was put by Shravan garu anyway. He has a Telugu keyboard. I don't.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
It's me, yes.
So Bhishma garu is saying, sorry, I'm late. I'll watch replay. Namaskaram. Western philosophy is borrowed, sorry, copied from Greek and Roman philosophy. Sir, Greek and Roman philosophy is what we are studying. That itself, even today, they accept that the entire Western world was shaped by the Greek and Roman philosophy. Everybody accepts it, by the way. You know, and they also say that, especially in America, the Judeo-Christian values. That term is used quite a bit, basically, right? And the Judeo-Christian values were influenced by the Greek and Roman philosophy. And even today, when there is a discussion about philosophy, there's no new philosopher that people talk about. It's always Socrates or Aristotle or whatever it is, right? So they are aware, sir. Basically, they don't claim anything otherwise, right, sir? Good. So shall we close? Unless anybody wants to join, there are only two people watching or three people, right? The link is there. I haven't pinned it. Let me give the link one more time. We'll give the link and wait for a couple of minutes and then we can close. As I said, today is Father's Day, so I'm sure everybody is busy, right? Trying to
Link is
make it.
already there. There are only few
Yeah, yeah,
comments. I think it's, you can find
yeah.
it.
Link. I put the link right when I started, sir.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, Bhishma Garu, this book, Sophie's World, is an introduction to Western philosophy, like Western philosophy 101. And so far, the first 70 or 80 pages that we have read, today we stopped on page number 79, right? It's all about Athens and Rome, basically. And in fact, the Greeks preceded the Romans, basically. I mean, that's what the author is also saying. Yeah,
I think we can close.
we can close, sir. Sir, Lawyer Garu, thank you very much for joining and whoever joined us during this reading and in the comments. And whoever is going to watch this stream later, please like and subscribe. It helps us. And if you want to discuss any topic, please put a comment. We'll definitely take it up during the next session. Uh, Dr. Garu came in and, sir, no problem, sir. You can come anytime and then we can revisit some of these ideas. Okay. Don't lose the thought, please. Every one of these philosophical questions, frameworks, the idea is to get inspired for us to be able to look into our own lives. I'm not saying you should follow the Western philosophy, right? Nevertheless, there's nothing wrong in taking up a framework and saying, how does this apply to my life? Right? It doesn't have to be our own philosophies like Indian philosophy or Western philosophy, because admittedly, there was a lot of uh, borrowing and adaptation and things like that. Right? Whatever fills your cup, wherever it comes from, doesn't matter. All right, sir. Thank you very much. Have a happy Father's Day, and then we'll connect again next week.